So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Davide Casati. I work for Corriere della Sera, and here is Richard Gingras. Richard has worked with the news business for a long time, and he worked before at the public broadcasting television in the US. And then he worked at Apple, and then he founded his own startups, and then he landed at Google, and he's been working on news at Google right now for 8 years, 9 years?
A total of about 8-9 years, yes.
9 years, and he's right now the VP of news at Google in the world. I will try to get this conversation going for, let's say, about an hour, and then open up for a few questions to the public. So I will start with this question for you, Richard. I'd like to start with a sentence I take from the late David Carr. And he was actually speaking about another tech giant. So I will try and edit a bit a sentence he wrote. And this is the sentence, slightly edited. For publishers, Google is a bit like that big dog galloping toward you in the park. More often than not, it's hard to tell whether he wants to play with you or eat you. Unquote. Which leads me to the first question, which is, why is Google interested in the business of news in the first place? When and how did Google's interest for news begin?
Well, first of all, I love David Carr, and I think we all miss him. Big dogs. Have you ever had a big... I've had several big dogs. I've had big dogs in households with small dogs. I've had big dogs in households with cats. And one thing I've learned is that size doesn't necessarily matter. Mm-hmm. In these regards. But to the point of your question, in truth, it's been important to us since the founding of the company. You know, if you look at the mission statement of Google, which is still the same mission statement, organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. Clearly, news is a part of that. In fact, I could say news is easily the most important part of it, right? News is what citizens need to be good citizens. So it's absolutely crucial that all of us and at Google, that we continue to work to make that better, that we continue to work with the publishing ecosystem, with the journalism community, to evolve the journalism space and evolve news such that it is ever more effective in an increasingly challenging world. That's why it's important to us. And we work quite hard at it. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes along the way. But over the last few years, particularly, we've worked very hard to collaborate with the industry, to work together on solving problems. And I think in doing so, I hope ultimately we'll get to that better place and again, give people the tools they need to be good citizens.
More and more people seem to use Google not just to find something they want to find in order to search, but also they ask questions, which leads to kind of a seismic shift, which is not just I use Google to find something. I use Google to find something that I think is true. I ultimately demand it to Google to let me know the truth, which is kind of a huge difference. So how does this change what you do and affect your responsibility in terms of news when we talk about that?
No, it's a very good question. And yes, people come to us every day asking us questions, billions of questions. In fact, interestingly, every day, 15% of the questions that people ask us are questions we've never seen before, right? So again, our own ability to develop and try to address those questions is something that continues to evolve. But I think it's important to note, and we talk about this a lot internally, yes, people come to ask us questions. And in some cases, we can give them a simple and explicit answer. If you ask Google how tall is Barack Obama, we'll tell you he's 6'1" tall. If you ask us what's the temperature, in your town, we'll tell you the temperature. But as we know, there are so many questions that don't have a singular or specific answer, right? It depends on perspective. Where are you coming from? I mean, even things like climate change. Most of us would agree that the climate is changing, but there are many different perspectives on what one should do about it. So from our perspective, the way we look at that is, if we don't have the right answer, then our objective really is, how do we give our users, how do we give citizens the information and tools they need to develop their own critical thinking about a subject and hopefully form their own informed opinion, right? It's not our job, I don't even think it's the world of journalism's job, to tell people what to think, but to help them evolve their own thinking with information that helps them drive towards an intelligent conclusion.
But so your responsibility, you see that your responsibility in terms of this kind of problem is to show people a huge number of results and not to indicate which one is a reliable source of information and which not.
Yes, in fact, I'll give you an example. For years I've seen surveys that say that Google or Google News is the most trusted source or a most trusted source of news. And I looked at that and said, well, it doesn't make any sense, right? We're not a source of news. We don't produce news. But when we dug into that, what we found that people appreciated, right? If you use Google News, is what we try to do is give you a diverse set of sources, a diverse set of perspectives. The latest news, we might surface a Wikipedia entry that gives you the background on a subject. If they're opinion pieces, we label them as opinion pieces. So it's that same notion of how do we give people a 360-degree perspective on a question, on a topic, such that they can be informed and come to their own conclusions. I think people appreciate that. They trust sources that, in a sense, trust the user themselves to come to an intelligent conclusion.
Do you think is your responsibility to point at news sources that are reliable?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, that's really, the core of what we try to do with our ranking, right? Is when we say, surface the best and most useful information, it is really all about how do we surface the most qualitative sources. And that's something that continues to evolve. As you might know, one of the things, we've been working to address the challenges of the ecosystem for a long time. 2 years ago, I, together with a journalist by the name of Sally Lerman, got together and founded something called the Trust Project. The Trust Project isn't a Google project. It's an initiative that involves news organizations from around the world. Editors-in-chiefs of some of the biggest publications in the world, from the Washington Post to La Repubblica, are on the leadership board. And the whole notion of the Trust Project is to really rethink, how does news present itself to users such that they can understand the content for the credibility that it has? And so one big part of that is, as an example, is how do news organizations provide both the user and the algorithm with more information about the author, the reporter, right? Can we develop a better sense, can the user develop a better sense and understanding of the expertise of the author? Can our algorithms develop a better sense of the expertise of the author, right? Because that's meaningful, right? All things being equal, I would rather put first the article from a reporter who has worked that beat, right? Their only focus is whatever, agricultural policy or foreign coverage, or the local city council, right? They have expertise in that area. That's very important. So I think as we approach these challenges, here too, that's really a great collaboration of how, as things evolve, do we help both users understand the nature of the work, as well as help algorithms make those determinations as well.
But in terms of making, you were talking about surfacing content which is relevant and helping people form a 360 degrees opinion on things. Don't you think these are proper missions of a media company in terms of these things are similar to what a media company does, giving a beat to someone who covers the beat, and he's really good at it, and I make him surface his content on my paper, and you do that on a platform, which is not a platform, but it's relevant. So, how do you respond to someone who says, okay, why you never say you are similar to a media company?
Because we're not, right? I mean, we operate a search engine. I mean, even Google News, in a sense, is a search engine. The underlying question behind Google News is what's in the news today, right? We're not out there authoring content. We obviously algorithmically do our best to analyze that content. But whether it's Google as a technology platform in search, for instance, or whether it's a news organization with an editorial team and reporters, I think in a sense we both share the same objective of how do we develop that sense of trust on the part of the reader, right? I mean, I think that is so crucial, particularly today, where we have such extraordinarily deep partisan divides around the world. And how do we bridge that? I think that's a challenge for all of us. How do we regain the trust of our users, of our readers, such that they, again, can develop informed opinions about subjects? Interestingly, I was talking to someone a while back on the whole question of advocacy. And news organizations typically don't want to be advocates of a particular position on an issue, but in a sense, where they should be advocates is of the issues and concerns of their readers, of their communities, right? And I think that's enormously valuable. There's a young woman by the name of Jennifer Brendel who has a small startup called Harkin. And one of the things she talks about is the value of a news organization reaching out to their community, understanding their community's needs, bringing them together such that they could establish that bond of trust. Like, what does that news organization mean to me as a citizen in a community, right? So I think it's important for all of us to really think, how can we build that trusted relationship? That's clearly the challenge we see in the world today, where far too many people have lost a sense of agency, that no one represents their point of view. They've lost a sense of trust in institutions, whether they be governments or whether they be the press. And that's deeply unfortunate. And in my own view, the future of our democracies depend on us addressing and fixing those issues.
So there's a number of initiatives that you are working on that somehow influence the news business, the way publishers deliver news, especially on mobile, the way you work to confront fake news. So I'd like to touch on all of them, but I will start with a question which is at the core of what we do.
Yeah.
So editors are more and more losing control of the distribution of their news, which raises serious questions about how the costs of journalism will be supported, who will get to determine what kind of formats will flourish and will not, and who will control the audience data. So these are worries that we, as news organizations around the world, share. So how do you share these worries, and how are you working on them?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure I accept the notion that, I think it's too simplistic a notion to say that editors and publishers have lost control of their distribution. I mean, if you look at it in the sense of where we were 40 years ago with the metropolitan newspaper in the United States, yes, they control their distribution almost monopolistically, but in their own quest to find new readers, right, they put their product on newsstands, they put news boxes on street corners, they put free copies on airline seats. When I look at the digital ecosystem today, when I look at search today, when I look at social networks today, those in a sense are the extensions of that model. How do you find new audiences, right? It's in a way, it's an extraordinary opportunity. And we've seen, all of us have seen, digital products, whether they be the Huffington Post or BuzzFeed or smaller properties, rise from nothing to significant audiences because they understood how they could, in a sense, take advantage of that ecosystem to build new audiences. So, when I look at it in that regard, I say that you have a tremendous opportunity here to build new audiences, and frankly, at comparatively less cost than you did 40 years ago when you were paying the newsstand to carry your paper and paying to put the news boxes on the street and paying to put the free copies on airline seats.
Okay. So, in terms of the worries that we share about the loss of control is, I mean, editors do feel like it was easier somehow.
But look, I mean, no question, it is also a much more competitive environment.
It is,
right? You went from a world where we all knew the small number of publications in our countries, the national newspapers, the local newspapers, the key magazines. You could count them, on your hands. And here we now live in a world of almost complete and total free expression, where those same publishers are competing with young startups, they're competing with bloggers. It's a very, very different competitive environment, without question. Mm-hmm. And certainly that comes with its challenges as well as its opportunities.
When we talk about challenges, particularly I was thinking about some different business models. So do you think that ad-based news media will still be viable in the near future, or will some sort of subscription-based news model become ubiquitous in the news media landscape, and how will you work on this?
I think the business model behind any form of media will vary depending on the kind of content you're talking about, the target audience for that content, and advertiser interest in that content. So it will vary. The interesting thing, I'm a student of the economics of news. And if you look back at the history of the economics of news, say back in that heyday of the modern newspaper in the United States, they were extraordinarily successful. Why were they successful? They made their money not off of the hard news content. They made their money off of the fashion section and the cooking section and the style section and the automotive section. And that drove immense amount of revenue, which in a sense subsidized the news content. Right? As I point out, for instance, but that doesn't exist today because, and I learned this when I was running Salon Media, right? When I was running Salon Media, the CPMs against hard news content were comparatively low, and so we created other sections like food and fashion and so on. But what we found in those areas is that we were competing with 25 sites on the internet in the United States that were focused just on food, for instance. So that cross-subsidy model doesn't quite exist anymore. So it depends on the kind of content. You can clearly be successful on the internet with what we call soft content as an advertising model. But I think it's also clear that if you're talking about high-quality hard news, then that's not likely to be the sole source of revenue. I think clearly subscription revenue is going to be an increasing component, right? In the United States, by the way, subscription revenue historically for newspapers was a single-digit percentage of the revenue. At best, it covered the cost of the paper that the news was printed on. But clearly, it's different in this world. We're seeing progress there. The New York Times has just reached the point of 2 million digital subscribers. Digital subscribers. That's more subscribers than they ever had in print. Right? Now, and they're obviously continuing to make progress. Now, that's the New York Times, and they spent 8 years really working out that model of the paywall to get there. And clearly, we're seeing more news organizations move in that direction, and I think that's smart. And from our perspective at Google, we recognize that, and we'll also work with them as best we can to help drive that revenue on the subscription side as well.
Okay. So another project you've been working on and you kind of envisioned was AMP.
Yes.
So it's been around for a while now. So what are the results of that? And so first of all, did it ever come to your mind to do that? How can we differentiate from other things that speed up the consumption of news, and what's the results that we are seeing?
So the key insight back a few years ago was those of us here who remember the web at its beginning, we used to call it surfing, right? You'd surf the web, you'd go link to link and explore and enjoy. You can't really surf the web at the moment. It's too slow, it's too sluggish. We all think twice before we click on a link. Will it be worth that 10 seconds by the time the link loads and resolves, right? It's not as compelling as it used to be. And particularly a few years ago, looking at that, and you see the rise of proprietary platforms, the rise of messaging platforms, social networking platforms, easy to understand why people were spending so much time on those platforms, not that they're not compelling in their own degree, but that the web, by comparison, was not, right? And that's crucial, because without the open web, we won't have a healthy news ecosystem. Absolutely crucial. So that was the core insight. So AMP, which is accelerated mobile pages, but AMP is really about re-architecting the web for performance. It's in a sense smart HTML, open source for everyone to participate in. And I think it's been an extraordinary experience so far. The mission hasn't been accomplished. We have more to do. But if I look at the numbers today, we've indexed close to 2 billion AMP pages. AMP pages are now coming from 850,000 domains around the world. We're seeing 35 million new AMP pages every week. So it's obviously beginning to take hold. We and others in the open source community have continued to develop the AMP framework so that it has more and more capabilities to provide virtually every kind of functionality in a fashion that's both simpler to develop against and obviously far better performing. Also because, a core of the architecture of AMP was recognizing that the content experience came first and the advertising experience came second, because frankly in today's web, it's the advertising experiences that make web pages such awful experiences. They all try to load their ads at the same time, pages get janky, they don't care about performance at all, but the publisher suffers the price. And core at the philosophy of AMP was load the content first and make each component of the page responsible for their own performance, right? That was really important. Make every ad network and ad provider responsible for their own performance. So we've seen great progress so far. But again, more to do, more education to do, more development to do. But the true focus of AMP was make sure that the web continues to be a rich and compelling experience that allows publishers to succeed in a world where walled gardens, proprietary platforms are seeing an increasing significance of the attention of users. And that's a challenge. When we talk about the future of news and the future of journalism, we have to think about it in its every dimension, from journalistic forms to how we build trust to how do we architect the underlying systems to allow things to happen in a correct way. So AMP, really the key focus of AMP was how do we make sure that the web, again, continues to be compelling such that we don't end up in a position where as a news publisher or a publisher of any sort or a blogger or whatever, that your only path to success is through having a deal with a proprietary platform. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that as a criticism of proprietary platforms, except for the fact that the open web is crucial. And I ask those platforms as well to recognize that. For our democracies, for the sake of the health of news and journalism as we go forward, we need these open environments to be compelling. We need these open environments to allow publishers to develop their own experiences and not be tied within the walls of a platform and have to pay gatekeepers for the privilege.
Okay, so I was I was thinking about you know, the proprietary platforms. Do you see that as a place where people will more and more find the information they will need, and you see this as a threat? So you were saying this is a threat for democracy, right?
Yes, because you know clearly we do not want the ecosystem of expression to be dominated by any singular source, particularly one where the business relationships are required, right? That's why, again, the openness of the environment is so important. Mm-hmm. Absolutely crucial.
Okay. So I wanted to touch on the issue of fake news just a bit. So do you think that the biggest problem about fake news is at its core an economic one, meaning the money fake news editors manage to make by selling ads on their contents? Or and how, if so, how can you work on that? How can you help work on that problem?
Well, look, the motivations of those who create, quote, fake news, and I'll come back to the notion of fake news in a minute, their motivations are many and varied. Mm-hmm. They may have nefarious political intent, state actors of one form or another, and some of them indeed, and this has been true since the beginning of the internet, you know, are looking to take advantage of the internet to make some money. You know, without question. And we, as you know, we provide ad platforms used by more than 2 million websites and publishers around the world. And so we've had experience with this for a long time. Just in 2016, we eliminated 100,000 publishers who were using the platform inappropriately. And it's a whack-a-mole game. It's a game where we're constantly fighting people who come in. Like, we'd find sites frequently who would apply to be in Google News, and we'd look at it, and it would seem to be a legitimate site, have all the right information on the site. They'd come into Google News, and 2 weeks later, it would be a completely different site. Or 2 hours later, it would be a completely different site, right? So it's a constant battle between the bad guys looking to take advantage and the good guys who are trying to protect it. You know, certainly, and we continue to stiffen our defenses. We went through recently and strengthened our policies. We went back and reviewed all of the accounts and kicked out many more. But it's an ongoing problem. But it's not the sole motivation for those who are purveying fake news. And again, that term has become almost a nonsense term. Mm-hmm. Clearly there is, quotes, fake news. Mm-hmm. But I was very interested to see, and it's obvious, but it's not binary, right? And in fact, the interesting thing, I saw this bit of research recently done by the MIT Media Lab and the Berkman Center, Ethan Zuckerman and a few other people. And they had been studying for the last year the influence of media, including fake news, on the election. And their conclusion was this, that fake news, as we think of it, the fake news was not a major factor. The major factor were hyper-partisan sites, and could be on any end of the spectrum, who don't necessarily deal in absolute falsities but near truths, right? Don't deal necessarily in fakeness but misrepresentation of context. This is the true challenge that we face today in this, again, very divisive world, which is why I come back to that notion of how do we rethink what journalism is, how do we rethink what it means to be a trusted source of news, and from Google's perspective, how do we do a better job of giving people the opportunity to understand different perspectives and be smart about things. So it's far, you know, in fact, what I've often, since the whole controversy of fake news became a big controversy, you know, again, but it's always been there. from my perspective, it's like recognizing it as a symptom for what it is, which, as I said earlier, it's a symptom of a problem of people having lost a sense of trust, right? Of losing a trust in institutions. And so if they've come to a certain political opinion, they're very vulnerable to that confirmation bias. And so how do we break through that? Not an easy challenge, not an easy challenge. But again, as I've noted to people of late, this is a true challenge for our democracies, right? I'm a strong believer in free expression. I serve on the board of the First Amendment Coalition. It's just very much of what I've always believed in. But we have to recognize today that the interesting question about democracies today is how can democracies survive and thrive in a world of unfettered free expression, right? Democracies thrive when you can build consensus between diverse points of view. But what we've seen, of course, is people can use free expression in inappropriate ways to build, in a sense, divergent realities. And how do we bridge the gap between divergent realities, right? And that's why I say what we need to do is how do we rethink journalism? And there are a lot of interesting dimensions of how we rethink journalism.
Okay, so I was thinking about trying to build on what you were saying. If the issue is polarization, as much as it is fake news, how do we try to reach out to people without? I mean, the confirmation bias is such a powerful thing that reaching out to people and just telling them, okay, this is not true. You're reading something which is not true, might not be enough. So how can we work on that to make that work?
Yeah. Well, again, I think there are many, many dimensions of it in terms of how one regains trust or helps people find truthful information. And again, there are many pieces. What I constantly say is, look, let's recognize there are no silver bullets, there are no quick solutions, right? We have to look at it every dimension, the architecture of the web, the nature of trust, and new journalistic models, right? Just this week, yesterday, we launched fact checks across Google search. We launched fact checks on Google News back last fall. We've actually been working on that for several years, right? These things don't happen overnight. We worked with the community of fact check organizations to help them grow. We worked to build the schema to allow fact checks to be created and offered at such that we could surface them in our canvases. And when we do that on search, that means they'll surface not just against issues of news and politics, but say health, all the areas where we know there is misinformation out there on the web that people can find. And how do we help them understand the truth? Now, fact checks, people who are hardened into their silos of opinion, fact checks may not help. But research has shown that they do help with people who, do have a greater sense of being open to information. So we think that effort with fact checks, again, one important piece, but is a key piece. And we'll learn from that as we go along, because there too, with fact checks, there are very few things where there's an absolute truth. And if you look at fact checks, very often it won't be true or false. It'll be, well, there's an element of truth, but it's been misrepresented and put in an inappropriate context. Important to know. So, but as that fact check community grows, we, from our perspective, will look and see, well, where is there consensus? Where are there differences? Can we surface those nuances? Again, with the objective of helping the user form their own opinions about what's right and wrong and what perspective they should take on an issue.
Another key point is when we think about artificial intelligence and how this enters in the field of news, particularly if you think about artificial intelligence applied to different sector of the news business. I was thinking about, they announced that the New York Times will have a homepage which will partially vary, will be tailored on a community of one, because it will vary depending on the person who is reading it. Or it's already shaping the kind of replies you get when you ask your assistant about the President of the United States or the bombing in Syria and so on and so forth. So how do you see this as a challenge and how do you see this as an opportunity? Because I can see the opportunity pretty clearly, you know, when you talk to someone and say, okay, this will be just like a homepage tailored on you.
Yeah, well, let's keep in mind, look, as I often say, you know, technology has value, but it has no values, right? It's only as good as what we use it for, whether it be machine learning or any kind of technology. Machine learning will clearly, anyone who uses it will help us understand data in powerful and different ways. Right? We've already seen machine learning in our work at Google be better at understanding X-rays than an oncologist is, which is extraordinary. But they can build those patterns off of massive amounts of data. So obviously fascinating potential. But again, what do you use it for? We always have to be careful, I think, about reinforcing silos of thought. Right? That's dangerous. In some cases appropriate, in the sense of, if I understand your interests, in divine, for instance, that you have a particular interest in woodworking or a particular interest in basketball versus baseball, is that appropriate to help tailor my product? Yes. But when you look at issues like news and politics, I go, you don't want to silo that. You want to make sure that people have a sense of perspective, because otherwise we will not cross that gap, close that gap, and we will not have the functioning democracies we so desperately need. So again, one thing to have great technological capability, whether used by Google or used by a publisher or used by anyone, but it's always up to our own wisdom of a society as to how we use that, right? That's, I think, the powerful question that we all face, is to make sure that we use the technology in ways that are appropriate to the needs of our societies, to the common good. Not an easy challenge for all of us, but that's the challenge we face.
When thinking about, you know, I was thinking about the kind of assistants that we all use more and more. The fact that we are using, for example, voice as a tool, you know, to ask things and get an answer, is different. That kind of experience is different from the one I get when I look for something on a screen, and then I see just like a bunch of entries. That's one thing on, let's say, on a laptop, and that's one thing on the mobile. But it's even different when using an assistant. So how do you see that as a challenge, and how will you work on that?
Well, I mean, again, you know, the world of virtual assistants is at a very, very early stage. It's on page 1 of chapter 1 of a long novel, right? There's a lot to learn. I think that, you know, to suggest that we can ever be comfortable with the notion that for any question there's a singular answer would be unwise, right? And so that, too, that challenge, at least from our perspective with virtual assistants, is, well, how do we address that? Because again, there is no single answer, there is no single source. You need to give people a sense of perspective. How we do that in the world of virtual assistants remains to be seen. But again, that's, you know, how do we use the technology to make sure that we're doing the right things, whether we be Google or anyone else.
Okay. And you were also talking about the huge amount of data that is out there, and you're putting a specific attention to those kind of data journalism that we tend to use more and more. And how will you work on that specifically?
I think, I've felt for a long time that data journalism is it's the one new capability that has such vast potential for journalism, and much of it still untapped. And there's a lot of remarkable work being done. But again, there too, we're at the earliest stages. But I think it's so vital. And again, there too, I've been developing an initiative with people in the data journalism community on just that point. And let me give you a sense of the thought process. Again, one of our challenges in our world today is there's this increasing gap between how people perceive the world around them, largely driven by anomalistic news events, a catastrophe here, a terrorist bombing there, that we all read about and are appropriately covered by news, though sometimes disproportionately covered by media, because, it bleeds, it leads is still true. But they develop this sense of the perception of the world around them, and then inaccurately, in many cases, translate that to a sense of fear in their own communities. And I had an experience several months ago, and that triggered an insight on my part. I was visiting some friends in a very sleepy, peaceful town in New England, a house on a golf course. And we're there having a nice evening, and someone hears noises outside the house, and another adult in the household goes outside with a loaded gun, a loaded 9mm gun. And I'm going like, why in the world would that happen? And in the back of my mind, in a sense, I knew, because we have these events that drive people's fears, right? But that night I went online because I wanted to make sure, well, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there was a string of armed burglaries going on or whatever. But that wasn't the case. What I found was that there had been 2 murders within the last 2 years within a 5-mile radius. And guess what? There was domestic violence, right? There was no particular reason for the fear. But that's not what formed in their heads. But that experience also pointed out to me that that data is out there, but it's too often hard to find, and it's unfortunately not part of the fabric of our lives. And so the notion of this initiative is, how do we take data journalism and bring it to a greater level of prominence in the world of media? How do we make data journalism and the components of data journalism first-class media objects? So that way, the next time I come to search in a few years, if I'm looking for crime rates in my community, I get a chart and a graph for my community because it's been tagged and indexed properly and structured properly and hopefully created as an embeddable unit, so that, for instance, when a reporter is writing a story about, say, a home invasion, maybe they can actually plug in that component and say, but for context, this is how infrequent this occurs. Or maybe it does happen frequently, but give that data-driven context. And beyond that, I thought metaphorically, what is the chart and graph we look at every day? It's the weather report for our communities, right? It tells us whether or not we need an umbrella. Well, why does not the weather report for our communities also tell us about the health of our communities in its other dimensions, the other key metrics of our communities, such that we can bump into it every day, not look for it, bump into it? Right? What's the status of our education system and graduation rates? What's the status of housing costs or air quality index or crime rates? Right? How do we bring this much more into a prominent position in how people see their world and their communities, so that when next time they go to the ballot box, they're more informed from a real data-driven perspective and not simply an anecdotal story perspective? I think this is hugely important. And it won't happen overnight. But this is, I think, is the kind of thinking, not just that. There are many creative people out there thinking about these things. But how do we really rethink journalistic models to address the problem from all of these different dimensions? I think it's absolutely necessary that we do so. And from our perspective, that's why I say, I sort of look at my job as and I'm an extraordinarily fortunate person to be able to do what I do. But what I look at my job is, again, we're a technology platform. But what we can do is, how do we help with the architecture of the evolving ecosystem, whether that be AMP, whether that be trying to drive new technical architectures to data journalism, or new trust models such that we end up with a better ecosystem, or new monetization models such that we end up with a better ecosystem. That's my job. That's what we're trying to do. As best we can, and we'll continue to do so.
When talking about new monetization systems, how do you see this going? Because we touched on this before when we were talking about different business models for this different newspapers or news media, and you were talking about the different content which will drive different business models. How do you see this going? How can you see Google helping out? Because you were saying, this is my job, this is what I can work on. So how are you?
Well, as I said, as I mentioned earlier, one thing is with paywalls is, are there additional things that we can do on our end to help with like a low friction approach to discovery funnels, such that we can increase the likelihood that people will want to subscribe? Can we find data that helps a publisher understand the propensity to pay? That's that dimension. The world of advertising, I mean, here too, the world of digital advertising, maybe it's not page 1 of chapter 1, maybe it's chapter 10 of the long book, but it's still an evolving environment. and it will continue to evolve. You know, we've seen, I think, interesting progress with the notion of branded advertising, native advertising. The New York Times, now 30% of their ad revenue is native advertising. You know, how do we evolve those approaches? You know, how do we evolve approaches that allow a news brand or a publisher to, in a sense, better leverage the affinity that people have with their brand? You know, some 40 years ago, God, did I say that?
You just did.
Geez, scary. 40 years ago when I was 5, I happened to do some work with the New Yorker magazine. And one thing I found there, which actually I had forgotten until today, was that they basically fact-check their advertisers. And not just the big ones in the front of the book, all the little ones in the back of the book. Because they wanted to make sure the advertisers were appropriate to their brand, right? And I think that's such a powerful principle. And in a sense, that's also what one gets at with native advertising. So how do we evolve those models? You know, I find it deeply unfortunate when I've had these experiences where I go to a news property, and I understand because it's such a challenging space today, right? And revenue is hard to get. But I come to a high-quality news property and read an article, and I'm about to click on another article, and what do I see at the bottom? But, you know, those, I won't name the companies, but, you know, those little pieces of content that are really ads, and one of them says, like, oh, click to see the 10 ugliest spouses of Hollywood celebrities. I go, well, what's the brand about? And then I click on the next article from that publication, and I get a thing that asks me to subscribe. And I say, well, what am I subscribing to? What's the value of the brand? Is it about the article I just read? How do those ads at the bottom of the page impact my perception of the value of the brand? So clearly there's a lot of work to be done there. And I don't for any, to me it would be absurd to think that the world of advertising won't continue to evolve. Again, part of that with AMP was along with AMP, we've now also introduced another open source project called AMP Ads. And AMP Ads is also about rethinking the technical architecture for ads to make things perform better. And also to try to drive a better recognition of a quality experience with advertising. So there's a lot of work that we can do there. And we have to hit the monetization question at every dimension as well.
Okay. So another question that I wanted to ask, which is so let's imagine we walk down the stage and then you got an offer from the New York Times telling you, okay, let you just leave Google, come with us, and you accept that for some reason, and you become their editor and their CEO. So how will you approach your job in terms of talking to tech companies from that perspective?
How would I talk with tech companies from that perspective?
Yeah, and how will you work? What kind of relationship you will establish with tech giants or tech companies, or
Well, again, first of all, as I noted earlier, or maybe I didn't, I find the term platform being used in a too generic sense. There are all kinds of platforms. We're a search engine platform. Fine. I guess I would do what I advise folks to do now, is work with other companies in the ecosystem to collaborate, to learn, and vice versa. As you know, we mounted this digital news initiative in Europe, which I think has been very effective, though I don't like to score it. I'll let the publishers we work with score it. But I'll tell you what has been extraordinarily valuable to us. Right? There were 3 legs of that effort: education and training, innovation funding, and the third was collaboration on product efforts. The collaboration on product efforts was enormously helpful to us because we learned things, right? The interesting thing about tech companies and media companies is, we just come at it from different perspectives, and by nature we tend to be suspicious of each other. And as much as anything, it's because we don't collaborate enough, right? And so I think that's so powerful. They learn from us, we learn from them. They learn from us approaches to, how do we, for instance, what drives innovation on our side is simply the recognition that innovation and success is a journey. right? We're constantly experimenting. At any one given time in search, there might be 100 experiments running, testing out different things with segments of our audience, so that we can learn, and move forward. And I think that's true of anyone in the digital space. And some news publishers are becoming more and more effective of this. How can they build their own technology stacks that give them the opportunity to experiment and innovate more quickly? I think that's absolutely crucial. Because if there's one thing that we know is that the situation in the ecosystem is going to continue to change, right? If you asked anyone 10 years ago about the notion of social networks and said, you would have said, what's that about, right? Didn't know it. What's it going to be 2 years from now? We know it's going to be something else. Media forms change, storytelling changes. So how do we evolve along with that? So if I were in that position, that's what I would do. It's very much about setting up the right culture for innovation. And I understand that in many regards, particularly for legacy publishers, is the biggest challenge. It's the cultural challenge of how do we create a culture of employees who have the freedom to innovate, who have the freedom to make mistakes and not be punished for them, because that's where we learn. So how do you create that kind of culture? How do you create that kind of technology environment such that you're willing to experiment and explore and change? And it's hard. I mean, I'll tell you, I've been...
I would just add one thing. It's not just hard. It might be expensive.
Yes, well,
I mean, it's expensive to create something that doesn't work.
You don't want to intentionally make mistakes.
Oh, yeah, no.
But my point
yeah,
is, you do not learn without trying.
Yeah.
Right? Launch fast, launch often, learn, rinse and repeat, right? Because we don't know. Otherwise, you're just making guesses. And I'm comfortable believing in my gut, but I also know over the years that I'm wrong a lot of the time. As I've often told folks, I've had an interesting career of, working in the digital space for 35 years. And one thing I tell people is, like, what's different between me and you? I've had the opportunity to make a whole lot more mistakes than you have, and hopefully learn from them. So I think that's absolutely crucial. But what I say is, you're right, it's expensive, but then again, there are approaches you can take. How do you build that technology environment that makes it easy to experiment? You can do it in such a way that it's cheaper. But that's the cultural challenge is hard. I remember when in between stints at Google, I went and I ran a company called Salon Media, salon.com. Glenn Greenwald was with us at that time. And it was a fascinating digital property at that time. And even then, when I went in there, because it was a pure digital play founded in 1996, I know because I gave them their seed funding. So I went back and ran it, and I came back and I said, and they were having troubles. I said, we need to rethink everything. And everyone said, excellent, great, let's rethink everything. Which was fine until we got to their part in the equation. And one part of the equation was, I said, rethink storytelling. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying, when I look at our long-form articles, only 25% reach the end. So I'm just saying, let's experiment. But that's hard. Right? It's hard. If you've worked your entire career a certain way, it's hard to break out of that box and think in new ways. That's the cultural problem, is how do you enable that? And it's not easy. No way would I suggest it's easy. And I don't criticize organizations who struggle with that, because I do know how hard it is. But that's exactly what you have to approach it. As I've often joked, because I think organizations that have chief innovation officers, that's crazy. The chief innovation officer is the CEO or the editor in a news organization, right? Because you want innovation to happen everywhere in the company.
Okay, so if we will have 10 more minutes if we want to open up for questions from the public.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm Francesco Facchini, and I'm a journalist who's developing the culture of mobile journalism in Italy. So I'm going to ask you something particular, just to tell you that we need to know your advices to be more profitable economically, riding on your platforms, also if we are freelancers, because 70% of our job market is made by freelance. And I would like to ask you if we can accept the challenge to be publishers by ourselves, become not only bloggers, but news
Yes.
storytellers with this kind of language that I think is changing the newsrooms of a lot of media companies around the world. And the second question I give you is that if you have found, in your opinion, a news business that is working on the web, that is giving perspectives economically and on the point of the job also.
No, you raise an absolutely important and powerful point. One thing that's very clear to me as the news ecosystem evolves is that we're going to see a richer amount of experience in the torso and tail, not just the head. And we're seeing that. We're seeing small news organizations pop up. I met recently with the head of a small chain of community digital news organizations in Canada who's achieved significant success. They're small, but he's done a very nice job of building a common technology environment from the build on and so on. I think there's something powerful there. And frankly, one of the things I think about, this is about as far as I can go with it, is how do we enable more of those? One of the things that pains me is it's still too hard to actually create a new news organization, whether it's one person or 3 or 20, right? There's too much technology I have to work with. That should be turnkey, right? You should be able to get up and running in a day, and you shouldn't need an engineer to do it, right? So I think there's more opportunity there. And I think it's really, really important that we figure out how to take and enable that. So it's something that I do think about a lot. And we do see success. I mentioned the group in Canada. Another one that I frequently mention is Mediapart in Paris, Edwy Plenel, right, who was editor-in-chief of Le Monde. And 8 years ago, he left and he formed Mediapart. Mediapart has a paywall. They have 120,000 subscribers paying like 10 euros a month. They're profitable and they employ 45 journalists. Now, to me, the key there is understanding what's your value proposition for your target audience, right? Because the one thing that does concern me, we can say paywalls are important to quality journalism, but they will only work to the extent that you have a value proposition that people understand. I saw a piece of research recently that really made this point extraordinarily clear. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, metropolitan paper in Minneapolis, they did research on why people were giving up the subscriptions. The single most cited answer was, I subscribe to the New York Times. What does that say? Great for the New York Times, but what it says is that those readers of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune did not have a good sense of the local value proposition of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. It may be understandable because 20 years ago, 40 years ago, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune was in a sense your national paper as well as your local paper. It's not the case anymore, right? You have to rethink the product for the market. You have to understand the value proposition for the market. And only once you do that can you be successful. Has to have a value proposition, has to be easily understood. But I'm fully confident that people will find that. But here too, I think sometimes it's tricky for the embedded players to address that, right? Because of the disruptor's dilemma, right? What they have a hard time doing is it's always trying to justify, well, how do I continue what we always did that was successful, and how do we do new things and innovative to find new markets for them? That's hard. Whereas you've got new people coming into the environment with that very clean sheet of paper and saying, how do I build something that people will value? So I think there's great opportunity there, and I think it can be fueled by better approaches to make it easier for those operations to come into existence.
There was another question there.
Yeah, hello. Okay. Thank you, great speech. I'm from a pro-Arab Spring news organization. Your commitment to democracy is fantastic, and I think one of the issues that you're talking about with regards to perspective, opinion versus fact is crucial. But given the Arab context, it becomes a bit problematic because like many news organizations, Google is our best friend, followed by social media. But sometimes in the region, it's also one of our greatest obstacles. Because in authoritarian states or police states, what you have is a plethora of news outlets, but very, very few of them are independent. So when you said that you're trying to offer readers as many diverse sources as possible, what happens in an authoritarian state is that that's essentially propaganda dressed up as diversity. So you have 20 or 30 or 40 outlets that are all really funded by the same source. So independent organizations like us are up against the wall because Google says, you know, here you are, you can read this,
Right.
and this. We get drowned out, number one. Number two, obviously, I'm also a libertarian, like yourself, too, and I don't want you, you know, to be in a situation where we're telling people what to think or what's right and what's wrong in terms of opinion. But again, is there a way of Google, for example, working on some kind of algorithm or audit or something? Because fact-checking, particularly when it comes to statistics, I'm sure is a lot more straightforward. But when it comes to things like people in the region saying statistics, you have nothing to go back on to check. There is no transparency. Budgets aren't set and publicized and published, and there are no freedom of information. Yeah.
No, it's a very important question, and some of these are hard challenges to solve. You know, I know one thing that we increasingly discuss is how do we, again, I think transparency is important. For instance, with a news organization, I think the ownership is important. You know, and one of the things that we think about is, you know, how do we drive, which is an element of the trust project as well, not that that's the only way to get here, but how do we drive more transparency about ownership? Recognizing, by the way, that if there is no information about ownership, that's its own interesting signal. But if the ownership is a government, well, that obviously tells you something as well. And again, people play games with this, so these aren't easy tasks. But I think, again, what I often think of is, you know, because there's a lot of discussion in the world today about how do we drive media literacy. A couple of points about that. You know, media literacy, in a sense, comes down to two things, is how do I understand the expertise of the source and how do I understand their motivation, right? And in a sense, I think that's increasingly what we have to get to as well, is how do we understand expertise, how do we understand motivation? Ownership, in a sense, often gives a hint at motivation. Not, again, easy problems to solve, but I think that's something that we need to get to. Speaking of media literacy, by the way, you know, for instance, I worked at Apple at the time when we stopped putting manuals in the boxes with the computers. We did that, one, it saved a couple of bucks, but the main reason we did it actually was we didn't feel that users should need a manual to use the computer, so put the pressure on the designers to design a product that didn't use your manual. So I would say the same thing, and I say this in our own efforts at Google and with news organizations. Does someone need a user manual to understand the nature of your news product? You know, if you put the most esteemed publications out there, you say the New York Times, and put it to someone who's not absolutely familiar with the New York Times and ask them, tell me, which parts of that front page is fact-based news coverage, what's opinion, what's perspective, and I can guarantee you most people will fail. So how do we do a better job of that? Again, I'm just not pointing at news organizations, but at news organizations, how do you do a better job of presenting who you are? How do you do a better job of making sure people understand opinion versus not? I think these are important questions. And from Google's perspective as well, how do we increasingly evolve our experiences, including things like we do in Google News today, is if it's an opinion piece, make sure there's a flag next to it that says this is an opinion piece. Again, small pieces, but I think that is, again, part of the challenge we have is how do we address all of these small but important questions that end up being a richer whole and hopefully a richer and better solution.
I guess we will have to wrap up if there are no further questions.
So, I mean, I want to note in closing, I think as we all know, these are extraordinary times, extraordinary challenges. Challenges to not only journalism, but democracy like we've not seen before, right? We have a lot of work to do. And all I can say is from our perspective at Google is to continue to work at that and continue to work at it collaboratively Everything from how do we help make sure that high-quality, credible journalism is understood to be what it is? How do we help devise and work with the evolution of new models for monetization? How can we collaborate and help further with new models of journalism? How do we make sure to help that the architectures of open ecosystems are such that those ecosystems maintain their relevance and openness? And last but not least, that key question of how do we, in an increasingly divisive and hyper-partisan world, figure out the solutions to, again, bridge those differences, give people perspectives and the information they need in a absolutely assiduously apolitical way to help them become informed and be good, knowledgeable citizens. This is the challenge that we face. And we will do our best at our end to do that. We won't always be right, but I'm determined to continue to make progress in those regards. And I look forward to your efforts. I just every day am amazed at the work of people in journalism to do the work that they do as well as you do it. It's extraordinary. And I'm honored by the opportunity to work with folks on these problems, and will continue to do so. I thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time. Yes, we're done.
Si prega il gentile pubblico di lasciare la sala per permettere l'allestimento dell'evento successivo, utilizzando l'uscita posteriore. Grazie.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Davide Casati. I work for Corriere della Sera, and here is Richard Gingras. Richard has worked with the news business for a long time, and he worked before at the public broadcasting television in the US. And then he worked at Apple, and then he founded his own startups. And then he landed at Google, and he's been working on news at Google right now for 8 years, 9 years?
A total of about 8, 9 years, yes.
9 years, and he's right now the VP of news at Google in the world. I will try to get this conversation going for, let's say, about an hour, and then open up for a few questions to the public. So I will start with this question for you, Richard. I'd like to start with a sentence I take from the late David Carr, and he was actually speaking about another tech giant. So I will try and edit a bit a sentence he wrote, and this is the sentence, slightly edited. For publishers, Google is a bit like that big dog galloping toward you in the park. More often than not, it's hard to tell whether he wants to play with you. You see that your responsibility in terms of this kind of problem is to show people a huge number of results and not to indicate which one is a reliable source of information and which not?
Yes, in fact, I'll give you an example. For years I've seen surveys that say that Google or Google News is the most trusted source or a most trusted source of news. And I looked at that and said, well, it doesn't make any sense, right? We're not a source of news. We don't produce news. But when we dug into that, what we found that people appreciated, right, if you use Google News, is what we try to do is give you a diverse set of sources, a diverse set of perspectives. The latest news, we might surface a Wikipedia entry that gives you the background on a subject. If they're opinion pieces, we label them as opinion pieces. So again, it's that same notion of how do we give people a 360-degree perspective on a question, on a topic, such that they can be informed and come to their own conclusions. I think people appreciate that. They trust sources that, in a sense, trust the user themselves to come to an intelligent conclusion.
Do you think is your responsibility to point at news sources that are reliable?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, that's really, the core of what we try to do with our ranking, right? Is when we say, surface the best and most useful information, it is really all about how do we surface the most qualitative sources. And that's something that continues to evolve. As you might know, one of the things, we've been working to address the challenges of the ecosystem for a long time. 2 years ago, I, together with a journalist by the name of Sally Lerman, got together and founded something called the Trust Project. The Trust...
Or eat you, unquote. Which leads me to the first question, which is, why is Google interested in the business of news in the first place? When and how did Google's interest for news begin?
Well, first of all, I love David Corriere. I think we all miss him. Big dogs. Have you ever had a big... I've had several big dogs. I've had big dogs in households with small dogs. I've had big dogs in households with cats. And one thing I've learned is that size doesn't necessarily matter in these regards. But to the point of your question, in truth, it's been important to us since the founding of the company. If you look at the mission statement of Google, which is still the same mission statement, organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. Clearly, news is a part of that. In fact, I could say news is easily the most important part of it, right? News is what citizens need to be good citizens. So it's absolutely crucial that all of us and that Google, that we continue to work to make that better, that we continue to work with the publishing ecosystem, with the journalism community, to evolve the journalism space and evolve news such that it is ever more effective in an increasingly challenging world. That's why it's important to us. And we work quite hard at it. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes along the way. But over the last few years, particularly, we've worked very hard to collaborate with the industry, to work together on solving problems. And I think in doing so, I hope ultimately we'll get to that better place and again, give people the tools they need to be good citizens.
More and more people seem to use Google not just to find something they want to find in order to search, but also they ask questions, which leads to kind of a seismic shift, which is not just I use Google to find something. I use Google to find something that I think is true. I ultimately demand it to Google to let me know the truth, which is kind of a huge difference. So how does this change what you do and affect your responsibility in terms of news when we talk about that?
No, it's a very good question. And yes, people come to us every day asking us questions, billions of questions. In fact, interestingly, every day, 15% of the questions that people ask us are questions we've never seen before, right? So again, our own ability to develop and try to address those questions is something that continues to evolve. But I think it's important to note, and we talk about this a lot internally, yes, people come to ask us questions. And in some cases, we can give them a simple and explicit answer. If you ask Google how tall is Barack Obama, we'll tell you he's 6'1" tall. If you ask us what's the temperature in your town, we'll tell you the temperature. But as we know, there are so many questions that don't have a singular or specific answer, right? It depends on perspective, where are you coming from? I mean, even things like climate change, you know, most of us would agree that the climate is changing, but there are many different perspectives on what one should do about it. So from our perspective, the way we look at that is if we don't have the right answer, then our objective really is how do we give our users, how do we give citizens the information and tools they need to develop their own critical thinking about a subject and hopefully form their own informed opinion, right? It's not our job, I don't even think it's the world of journalism's job to tell people what to think, but to help them evolve their own thinking with information that helps them drive towards an intelligent conclusion.
But so your responsibility